So it's really my pleasure to introduce the panel today. And the panel is going to be talking about knowledge, expertise, policy in the exams crisis in England. This is obviously in the context of assessment policy during the COVID-19 pandemic. As you would know, since the emergence of the pandemic, like many aspects of education, examinations have faced significant challenges. And we've seen cancellation of national examinations last year in 2020. I think that was last year, 2020, wasn't it? We get confused about timeframes these days. We've seen the introduction of the algorithm to replace the examination scores. We've seen an outcry of the impact of the algorithm and subsequent reversal of the policies. So the seminar is really timely in exploring research findings from current project that offer some insights into the sources of knowledge and forms of expertise that mobilized or not in dealing with the decision making around the examinations. So we have a fantastic panel today. I'll very briefly introduce our speakers. So we have Professor Joanne Baird, who is Professor of Education and Head of Department here at Oxford. She was previously the Head of Research at the Assessment and Qualifications Alliance, where she managed the research program and was responsible for standard setting systems for public examinations. She's served as an advisor to the House of Commons Education Select Committee, has been a member of the Ofqual Standing Advisory Group and membership of the Welsh Government's Curriculum and Assessment Group. We have Professor Margaret Arnott, who is a Professor of Public Policy at University of the West of Scotland. She's an Associate Director of the Centre for Families and Relationships. She's also currently a collaborator on an international research project funded by the Norwegian Research Council held at University of Bergen in Norway. A third member of the panel is Professor Emeritus Jenny Osga, who was a Professor of Sociology of Education in the Department of Education from 2010 to 2015. She's an honorary professorial visiting fellow in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Edinburgh and has an attachment to the University of Umeå in Sweden. We also have Luke Stabile and Nicholas Hell, who are doctoral researchers and will be joining the panel discussion. So welcome to all the panelists, and I'm just going to turn over now to Professor Joanne Baird to kickstart the session.
Thanks ever so much, Sibel. In fact, if we could have the next slide, please, Margaret. And I think Jenny's going to start here.
Yes, thank you. So the rationale set out here is an attempt to condense an explanation of why we find this particular moment interesting, why we think that the conditions created by COVID, and this is not to sound opportunistic, I hope, because obviously COVID has created tragedy and disaster for many people, but the conditions created by COVID allow us to explore what has been a really contested area in the study of education policy for many years, that is the relationship between knowledge, expertise, and policy. What we can look at in this particular context is what knowledge and expertise actually gets onto the agenda in a situation of crisis. So the crisis really highlights and casts a spotlight on some of the debates that we've been having for a very long time, perhaps particularly in England, about what kinds of knowledge are informing policy, what kinds of consequences does policy have for the shaping of knowledge. And at this moment, we are also really privileged because, as well as looking at this particular knowledge expertise relationship, we're able to compare how that relationship plays out across the different constituent nations of the United Kingdom. The nature of devolution allows us to see how those different areas, those different administrations, those different governing bodies address the problem of managing the impact of COVID on education, and thus again gives us another really sharp lens on what difference politics may make across the United Kingdom, and particularly the role of political leadership. So that's why we're interested in this particular moment. That's why we see that there's a real opportunity for exploring expertise, policy, and knowledge relationships in this period of crisis. And just one more point, it does seem to us, we were prompted to think more about this by the fact that education expertise seem to be largely absent from the discussions of responding to the crisis and then continuing to manage it. So that's the rationale. Next slide, please. And these are the questions that we're pursuing in order to try to explore this topic in more detail. What expertise is mobilised in the policy response in education in the UK and across the UK? And what networks of knowledge can we identify? Are those knowledge networks congruent with policy networks, or are they different? How do knowledge networks and policy networks interact? And again, what's the role of political leadership in setting out how these responses are framed and shaped? In this presentation, we're going to try to focus down on the exams crisis in 2020. Obviously, the kinds of questions I'm just raising now go beyond that. They go much further. They raise issues about what kinds of knowledge gets prioritized in education more generally. But here, for the moment, we're focusing on the exams crisis, mainly in England, but with some comparative points on Scotland. Next slide, please, Margaret. Thank you. And we're working with a set of theoretical resources that are interconnected, and which again, we've tried to summarize on this slide. We're working with ideas about governing, and here the focus is on England, and England as a place in a state of almost permanent change, permanent revolution, where we have new actors engaged in policy making, new actors who often have commercial interests in becoming engaged and are thus sometimes known as policy entrepreneurs. We have hybrids of public and private emerging, corporate outsourcing, which is of course further extended throughout the pandemic. And at the same time, attempts to regulate and manage and steer this very diverse governing landscape through the growth of regulatory agencies, and at the same time, a growth in the influence of political advisors. So we're looking at a framing set of concepts about governing, which sees these new networks also as connected to the emergence of data and data dependency as a way of knowing what's going on in a very dispersed system. The point I want to emphasize before we move to the next slide is that these developments of networks, standards, benchmarks, outsourcing, they've heavily disrupted established traditional relationships. They've displaced systems of accountability. They've, we would suggest, possibly limited or disconnected alternative sources of knowledge, particularly academic knowledge and professional expertise. Next slide, please, Margaret. So related to governing, concepts of governing, we have concepts of knowledge, and we argue that knowledge and governing are changing in relationship with one another. We see the externalization of policy advice, that is the creation of knowledge for policy outside the state in commercial, semi-commercial agencies, including regulatory agencies. At the same time, the knowledge production process is heavily politicized, and yet it appears to be objective, neutral, above politics, because that's how it's presented as depoliticized. And experts and consultants are more and more involved in this kind of work in coding knowledge, so that the fact that they're doing political work is not at all apparent. It looks like scientific, technical, data-based, objective work. And these things in the development of knowledge combine to create a sort of dependence on technical expertise, a search for solutionism, solutions to complex, really complex, intractable policy problems are seen to be achievable through the use, particularly of data-based solutions. So again, to summarize the knowledge governing relationship, it's becoming increasingly in-house, it's becoming increasingly standardized, it's becoming increasingly data-based, and there's a growth in the influence of people who claim to be able to translate complex knowledges into simplified, actionable knowledge. Next slide. So here we are then, before we get to the data, summing up. In England, we have a situation of what's been called policy churn in a systemless system, a system that is so complicated, so fragmented, so dispersed that we can't easily see it, and particularly we can't easily describe lines of accountability within it. So there's a terrific complexity in the communications and relationships that characterize England's education systemless system. Indeed, the Institute for Government's report on the management of COVID by the Department for Education highlighted the complexity of relationships as one of the key factors in its less than successful management of the pandemic. So the next summary point is that across the UK, this policy churn, constant policy churn, has unsettled relations that used to exist, not just in England, but within the constituent nations of the United Kingdom, making policy learning more difficult and also highlighting a breakdown in trust between the key policy actors involved. This is partly because there's different politics in the different parts of the UK, the different UK governments, and their claims to legitimacy are rather different. Finally, drawing on what I've said so far, I want to make use of an insight about the use of science as what Miller calls a connotative ideograph. In other words, the constant reference to science as a guide, following the science, the way that politicians are displaying science as a way of justifying their actions, and the simplified nature of that reference, so that science's real, true, genuine characteristics as disputed, as complicated, as slow, as sensitive to complexity, are sidelined by a characterization and performance of science as more simple, clearer, and more consensual than it actually is. Right. So the next slide, over to Luke.
Thank you, Jenny. So as a group, we've been able to pursue a number of different interesting methodological approaches so far, because of the breadth of what we're tackling and the wide range of available evidence. So we began with quite a wide sweep of the available documents in the public domain. So, for example, stage minutes, the exam regulatory bodies, board minutes, finding the relevant references to the decision-making process, and building up a structured picture of how the events of the exam crisis unfolded last year. And as I say, in particular, where there were clear references to where certain forms of expertise had an input. But we've turned particularly on a few things. We've been analysing speeches and significant public communications made by key actors, government ministers, for example, or board chairs of the regulators. And we've started that with a political discourse model informed by the theoretical resources that Jenny has laid out just now. But we've also, something interesting we've been doing is exploring the use of lexical corpus software, comparing the Four Nations discourse as they were, as key actors in the Four Nations were speaking about the events and the decision making. You see differences, emphases in the way that they spoke about the events. We've also had the invaluable opportunity to begin interviewing key actors who were intimately involved in the events, exploring with them how the decisions were made, what sources of expertise were prioritized, who was listened to and why, etc. And we've been pairing this interview process with qualitative social network analysis, investigating further issues like recruitment, what skills were prioritized on the boards, what job backgrounds did they want people to have, and also beginning some informal network analysis of the skill sets themselves to work out some of the network properties of the skill sets that were present in the regulatory bodies. So these are some of the avenues that we've begun. They're all ongoing. We've garnered many interesting things so far, and we expect many more to come out. Joanne, are you ready for the next one?
Thank you. So I guess one way in which we could also position ourselves as participant researchers as well, since Jenny, Margaret and I are all involved in policy processes that we also study. And in this particular case, we are focusing on 2020 and what happened with the exams crisis there. And my own involvement in that wasn't throughout the crisis, but I was a member of the expert group that selected the algorithm. So just to recap, because it has been a while now since the exams crisis of last year, there were some key moments which we're going to draw attention to, and then we want to home in on 3 decision points that we think were particularly interesting in relation to what knowledge was used in each and how contrasting they were. So if you think back, a lot of very quick policy decisions were having to be made by the government. And on the 16th of March, the Prime Minister in the House of Commons announced that schools were going to close, and that had clear implications then for the delivery of exams. Exams were actually cancelled a couple of days later, again announced in the House of Commons by the Prime Minister. And we know now from the evidence presented at the Select Committee hearing that Ofqual's primary advice was actually to hold some physically distanced exams. Can you have the next slide, Margaret? Thanks. So the Secretary of State for Education, as was then Gavin Williamson, issued a remit to Ofqual by letter, which is the normal mode in which this is done. And he indicated that through that letter that he wanted the outcomes to remain reasonably consistent with previous years, even though they had to devise a new system for producing assessment results that weren't reliant on exams. Now, that meant then that some standardisation would be required across teachers and across schools. And so it really meant that a statistical algorithm would be needed. So the need for an algorithm was set up really pretty early on. Very quickly after that, Ofqual then issued some guidance which gave centres the broad outline of what would be required of them by the 29th of May, which was to produce centre assessed grades, which were not just teacher assessed, but also had some element of standardisation, and that was prior to the application of the statistical model. Next slide, please, Margaret. Then by the 22nd of May, in broad terms again, Ofqual indicated that an algorithm would be used and gave some of the criteria that would be associated with that algorithm. And then it wasn't until a while later, although the algorithm was selected in between times, but then the publication about what the algorithm would be constructed of was produced in late July. Now, that there has been lots of criticism that that wasn't actually transparent enough, and that the public weren't informed about what it would look like in practice. Next slide, please. So on the 13th of August, which followed results released in Scotland the previous week, and also the U-turn in Scotland, the results were released by the exam boards based on the algorithm, and as we all know, there was a public outcry. There was lots of complaints about inequality in grading, and really the logic had changed about how grades should be produced. It was no longer based on students' performances in exams, and instead was based on statistics. So that disruption between students themselves and their own performances became a real political issue. The next debacle was really around the appeals system, and Ofqual had published an appeals system a couple of days later, and the government were not happy with it, and Gavin Williamson had contacted, we now know from the select committee hearing, had contacted Ofqual to say that he thought there were problems with the appeals system, and the government then released their own triple lock system, which involved mock exams, and Ofqual had problems in defining what would count as a valid mock exam, and they produced their own appeals system shortly after that. Next slide, please, Margaret. So the political turmoil around this, through public demonstrations, through the media, through backbench politicians complaining to the government, continued. And on the 17th of August, we've seen, as you will remember, a reversal in policy, and the results were issued on the basis of centre assessed grades. So at this point, the logic for the grades was now based on teachers' knowledge of students' work. But because some schools had actually produced their results by trying to take into account the statistics that were used from previous years' outcomes, and others had paid less attention to that advice, there were still complaints that the centre assessed grades were unfair. And again, inequality issues were raised in relation to the centre assessed grades as well. So it's not just the algorithm that actually raised these complaints. Next slide, please, Margaret. So we want to focus on three policy decisions in particular. One is there is the decision to cancel the exams. Now, what we saw there was that Ofqual's advice wasn't foregrounded there, but in fact it was scientific advice from members of SAGE. When we came to the selection of the algorithm, you can really contrast the sources of advice that were being used there. What we had was people who were technocracy insiders of the exam system, social scientists, as it were, educationalists, and we saw a political element to that too, as well as in the cancelling exams, because when it came to the use of an algorithm at all, that was driven by the requirement from the Secretary of State to standardise outcomes across years. And then the third decision point was to move back towards the selection of the centre assessed grades. And here we really saw politics coming to the fore, and it was not so much a technocratic process at all that was going in there. And in both of these second decision points, we don't really see science and SAGE as key elements of the decision making that was going on. Next slide, please, Margaret. So what we see throughout this policy process, which unfolded in response to the pandemic in 2020 in relation to the exams crisis, was that there was a political thread throughout. Now, as somebody who's spent quite a bit of my career interested in what exam standards mean, I would be the first to say that there's an awful lot of insider speak and technocratic publications around this. But equally, I also have for a long time made the point that actually public understanding and the public currency of the exams is really important in terms of how we understand standards. And we really saw that in summer 2020. So the political concern about grade inflation resulted in an algorithm being used, which, despite people's broad acceptance in advance of the exam results being released, there was lots of negotiation with stakeholders about the kinds of processes that were going to be applied. And people could understand the rationale for it until they actually had those results in their hand, and until it influenced how social goods were going to be distributed across society. The meritocratic argument had really broken down. What we normally see in exams crisis is that politicians can use regulatory bodies as scapegoats. That's been widely commented on previously. And we saw that when the results were released, that the public support for Ofqual was not forthcoming for a couple of days. The Prime Minister and the Minister for Education were standing by the algorithm and felt that it was key to suppress grade inflation, was the main political concern at that point. But after a little while, the politicians did agree that centre assessed grades needed to be issued instead. So there is a role for politics clearly throughout all of these decisions. But the crisis here and in other areas of policy really make us question, where does that accountability lie? What's the governance around that? What's the relationship between politicians and regulatory agencies? And how independent can these agencies be in the face of political pressure and public crises like this? Next slide, Margaret. I think over to Nicholas now.
Yes, thank you, Joanne. So just to highlight a bit of a comparative perspective from the Scottish situation. First off, the Scottish COVID response overall was stricter than several of the other UK nations, especially England. It meant keeping schools closed for longer quarantines, and decisions about the new implementations of assessments were presented several months in advance to England. And Scotland has, for instance, as you can see, already said that exams in 2022 will go ahead only if they're safe, whilst England has said that they will go ahead as usual. And in relation to what Jenny said about the connotative ideograph of science, some of the question decisions have been fiercely defended with the science term, as you can see in August of last year. Scotland has published or commissioned a range of reports, including 2 OECD reports that I believe that, well, these reports Margaret will touch upon briefly also. And these have been about assessment and the national curriculum. And the criticism has been rather harsh. Transparency has been criticized, and problem with scrutiny and review. And some of the high-standing goals of equity in the curriculum have been criticized as well, and this has led to a loss of confidence in the Scottish qualifications model, and that has led to some intense policy activity, including decisions to replace the Scottish Qualifications Agency and removing some of the competencies from Education Scotland, including review, and it is probable that a new agency will take on these parts. And there's also been an attempt from Scottish legislation to include the Convention of the Rights of the Child in Scottish law, though there is an ongoing process in the UK legal system about disputing this, the possibility to do that from the Scottish side. So I thank you, and over to Margaret.
Thanks very much, Nicholas. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points that were mentioned by Nicholas in terms of, I suppose, the spillover effects of decisions taken in what were seemed to be devolved policy areas in Scotland, in particular for this presentation. And we're thinking about the exams crisis, how the politics influences the governance and the approaches to consultation and the type of knowledge that we use in terms of thinking about what are the policy solutions that are actually thought about. And we kind of think about Scotland being first to abandon the algorithm approach, and other administrations possibly felt obliged to follow suit. And Joanne mentioned that in terms of the 3 decision points in terms of the education crisis to do with examinations in England, and the extent of interdependency across the UK in areas which are seen to be devolved to the kind of legislators in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but the interface with reserved areas and shared powers in terms of education and skills have significant effects in terms of what are the implications for the politics and accountability here. And that also ties into a wider debate, which we won't actually kind of go into much today, about Brexit and the internal market and how the kind of skills agenda and interface with the qualifications across the UK pose a host of quite kind of contentious political issues about how those will be kind of debated through in various kind of forms. So there's a larger issue of interdependency, and I suppose what this means in terms of the challenges for asymmetrical devolution. And what we're arguing is that Nicholas talked about there was a kind of reform trajectory in Scotland, and perhaps the Scottish Government is using the COVID responses to weave further educational reform agenda through it. And that's for further research that we're actually following through at the moment. And we also want to stress the different political contexts producing different styles of political leadership. And that's a wide area. We're actually interested in looking at basically the styles of political leadership, how it's presented in terms of the media and discourse, and just using the examinations crisis. You can see the First Minister of Scotland, Sturgeon, accepting responsibility in terms of political accountability that Jenny mentioned earlier on, and also in terms of the Cabinet Secretary for Education in Scotland, at that stage, John Swinney, now Cabinet Secretary for COVID responses, again apologises, and there's a review that kind of Nicholas talked about in terms of the Muir review of the Scottish Qualification Agency, and what will that actually mean for future reform agendas. And so we're kind of teasing the issues across Scotland and England here. So there's similar crises, exam cancellation, algorithms, we're entering the matrix and the solutions, but then we see kind of policy reversal. And there's a teacher and centre assessment-based approach in Scotland. And as also kind of stressed again in terms of political accountability, the politicians accepted full responsibility. And that goes to what Jan was thinking about in terms of the role of regulation and the agencies there in England and what that means for different forms of accountability. And an example here is the Scottish Government. We've got a brief quote here and saying creating a new specialist agency responsible both for curriculum and assessment. Now, that teases into a wider debate about the extent to which the curriculum for excellence actually relates to the higher stages of secondary education as well, and a debate about the qualification reform there as well. And that was reflected in terms of, for example, Nicholas talked about the Priestley report, the Muir review, the Stobart review, also Education Recovery Group and OECD. The other thing we'd want to kind of stress is that the nature of the practice of consultation is within the Scottish system. And again, we're using the word about a national education system and contrasting that with the policy churn and the lack of a system in terms of that kind of complex environment in England. And what that actually means in terms of who's providing different pieces of support, advice, knowledge to those nature of consultations. And Nicholas mentioned one example in terms of children and youth, and they're included in terms of a lot of the kind of the advisory groups for the government, also the Youth Parliament in Scotland as well is involved in terms of reflecting on the nature of reform as well. So we're kind of seeking ways in which we can capture different kinds of student skills and also teacher assessment being more continuous and school-wide. And that poses it back to the kind of Stobart review of qualifications in Scotland as well. So there's a wider range of academic and vocational strands, we'd argue, in the exam-wide society role of kind of education there as well. And pass it on, Joanne, to the conclusions.
Thank you. So although the exam boards and Ofqual have actually tried to be more transparent, they've issued several things over the years about that explain the assessment system and including standards. What we saw through the pandemic was that there were lots of commentators who really didn't understand what was going on, and I have to include Scotland in that as well. It didn't just happen in England. So there was a lack of understanding. People, I think because they've been to school that they actually understand the assessment system, but there have been lots of ways in which the system has developed over the years to try to tackle sources of unfairness, for example. So there was lots of discussion that was really talking at cross purposes and was actually very, very unhelpful. We also saw, especially in England, but this also happened in Scotland, how education policy had become to be dominated by technical fixes. So all of the focus on the algorithm is fascinating at many levels, but the idea that that standards could be set by a statistical approach that didn't engage stakeholders more fully, and so neglected the kinds of inequality issues that were going to arise when the exam results were released is really a fascinating thing, I think, for us all to reflect on as we look back on that. And it also raises questions about the kinds of voices that were not included or foregrounded in these decision-making processes. There are lots of examples here, not just about the exams crisis in particular, but also about things like how schools were being expected to run. There's loads of expertise in schools about management of schools, how they could be expected to open and close, how they would tackle issues associated with distancing and so on. There are lots and lots of ways in which others' voices could have been included, and we can see contrasts in that across Scotland and England. So Jenny spoke to the systemless system point, and one issue for England was that we have lots of academies now who report essentially directly to the Minister for Education. And this meant that local issues were quite difficult to grapple with. We didn't see the inclusion of local authorities to the extent that you might expect in a pandemic, and in a way that they were included in Scotland. So there are all sorts of governance issues here that we're picking up and are able to contrast across the two circumstances. The role of teacher professionalism and the accountability of that, it sits in a different place in any case in Scotland and England. It's been long established that teachers are more trusted in Scotland, that their views of standards are more highly regarded. There isn't the same competitive market-based approach to standards that we see in England. League tables are not the same either. Of course, in the crisis in 2020, league tables were actually suspended in England. But this also points to issues about the accountability of teachers under different systems when we're in policy flux like this. So engagement of educationalists more broadly was also not foregrounded in the discussions. We saw really in the selection of the algorithm that there were technical insiders, and of course we know from the data that we've collected that there were discussions with stakeholders more broadly, but we didn't see an awful lot of public debate across the educational sector when these policy decisions were made and the implications of them became more broadly known. So when the crunch time came to change back to the centre assessed grades, we really saw that it was concerns from the media and from politicians that really drove the discussions there. And this, for my own research area too, this I think is really interesting in terms of what assessment standards mean and whether technocratic approaches to that don't really look at the currency of qualifications and how they play out across society, that those are really not helping us understand what standards meant when we reach crises like this. Next slide. And I think it's over to you now, Jenny, to conclude.
Yes, I'm not sure that I can conclude. I'm sure if our audience is still there, they will have gathered that this is an absolutely enormous topic. And every time we pull a thread, more and more threads appear. But that makes it fascinating. But I need to stress at this point that we're only less than halfway through this initial inquiry. The more we find out, the more we need to find out. And our conclusions they're not conclusive, they're indications of how we're thinking and of some of the areas that we want to explore further. If you remember, I started by saying that one of the things that prompted this whole line of inquiry was a feeling that education wasn't actually present in terms of expertise and knowledge in the discussions that were going on throughout the response to the pandemic. The initial response, quite rightly and obviously, concentrated on the health issues and the health risks. But then as situations developed and decisions were taken, and as we've explored more, I think we can say that there is a surprising lack of engagement with wider social science and with education as a social science in the resources, the knowledge resources that were mobilized during this pandemic, and that may continue to be mobilized in the recovery as the recovery begins to get underway, we hope. And this sentiment was actually echoed by the House of Commons Finance Committee when it reported on its inquiry into how the pandemic had been managed. It made the point that we knew a lot and could find out a lot about the epidemiology and the model building that was involved in informing policy. But it was really hard to find out what was taken into consideration when policymakers were considering actions that would have very, very significant consequences for people, for young people, for children, for parents, grandparents, employers. All these areas of life were hugely impacted by the closure of schools and by subsequent attempts to manage the pandemic in the education context, including in higher education as well. So there is, we think, some justification for our desire to shine a brighter light on those areas, to make these people, the people who were conducting these inquiries and giving advice, more visible, to find out more about who they were, who they knew, how they connected with the policy world, what knowledges and disciplines they reflected, and what was taken up and what wasn't. So that's our trajectory, at least for the next few months, and I hope for longer. And these are just some references that appear in the presentation that may be of interest.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Sibyl, I think that's the end of our
Thank you very much to all the panelists for this timely and important research, drawing on educational research to paint the landscape of assessment policy in the UK.